Hello, and welcome to another of our lockdown live streams. This week, we're really happy to have Peter Geoghegan to come and talk to us. Peter, well, you probably know, but Peter is a writer, a broadcaster, and obviously a journalist. He's editor at Open Democracy. And if you're not familiar with Open Democracy, please do go and check them out. That's opendemocracy.net. It's just a fantastic resource for independent journalism. Peter's latest book is called Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics. So there it is. So we'd like to talk about that mainly this evening. So welcome, Peter.
Hi, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming along. It's great to have you. So I thought, could we start off? Is it possible for you to give? So obviously, your book talks a lot about the kind of mechanics of how dark money is being used as a tool for influencing, undermining democracy, essentially. I wondered if you could just give us a kind of brief summary of what the kind of main parts are of how that works.
Yeah, well, basically, so dark money really is like, it's an American term, a neologism really that comes from the States. Jane Meyer, the great New Yorker journalist, really made it quite famous. And what she was talking about is predominantly the way in which kind of anonymous funding worked in American politics. So you probably heard of things like super PACs, political action committees, people like the Koch brothers, these really famous billionaires, really rich guys who spent a fortune on influencing American politics. Ironically, actually, the one surviving Koch brother, Charles, gave an interview just after the American presidential election in which he seemed to bitterly regret all of the division in America. You know, well, Charles,
really?
if you hadn't spent well over $1 billion fomenting it, maybe you wouldn't have to worry about it now. But yeah. Basically, so that's where it kind of comes from. But really, in the context I use the term, I probably use it a bit more broadly, and I'm talking about any ways in which kind of unseen influence acts in our politics. So whether that's breaking electoral law by overspending, whether that's using front groups to funnel money into political parties, buying Facebook ads anonymously, all of that sort of stuff, think tanks that influence the political debate in ways that we've struggled to see, but kind of huge impact. So all of that, I think, is what I mean by it. And I use the term dark money really to try and give a sense in which how our political process has been pulled and shaped in ways that we struggle to see. And I think that really have qualitatively changed over the last decade or so. And what I'm trying to do is chart how that's happened primarily in Britain, but trying to give a flavour of it internationally as well, because it's not just a British phenomenon. We are seeing these sort of influence campaigns everywhere. But in some ways, Britain and America are particularly close because because our politics and our political parties run on money, private money. That does make us quite different to a lot of continental countries where the state often picks up the tab. It doesn't mean these kind of issues don't happen, but they're very much particularly prominent in British and American politics where parties are out to try and get money. So I've kind of trying to look at that and how that influence has kind of shaped and changed our politics. And I think in quite radical ways, in ways that we're still playing catch up to try and understand.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. So I was thinking in terms of who wants what here and who's getting what. And I wondered if you could sort of say something about that, because so on the one hand, you have people like, it's obvious that there are like capitalists, kind of ultra capitalists who essentially want a kind of deregulated economy, a small state or virtually no state. And that's, that seems easy to understand because it's just motivated by greed, really. But on the other hand, there's a political aspect to this as well, in which all of these cases you talk about seem to be on the political right, or most of them seem to be on the political right. And they all seem to be in the sense of pushing countries towards authoritarianism and being anti-democratic. How do these things fit together? Because it's not immediately obvious from the outside that they're part of the same thing at all.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've tried to kind of sketch. I think actually what we're seeing in the book I try and sketch is to try and give a sense of how this happens and why we are seeing a kind of both a turn to what looks like libertarianism and authoritarianism simultaneously. And I think in some ways it's because you can want political outcomes without all having agreed on the same destination. And I think the Brexit referendum was a really good example of that, actually, which a series of people are trying to influence politics for a bunch of different reasons. They want different outcomes. Actually, I was just this evening talking to a friend saying, like, should I go and read? I've all the LRB is kind of piling up, and Perry Anderson's, I think it's 50,000 words on the European Union from a kind of Lexit perspective. And so that's one version of Brexit. Another version is a kind of Nigel Farage version of Brexit, a very authoritarian Brexit, the Aaron Banks kind of spivification thing. And then you have the kind of, European research group. So there are all these different competing visions. But what's interesting about it is people want to make political change for different reasons. And you can want change. You can want change, without having a distinctive definition of an endpoint, you can still want to create political change. So I think that's one of the fascinating things. And also, I think as well as that, there's a bunch of different, kind of different currents at play. I think, like I mentioned earlier, the Koch brothers, they're huge, big funders, libertarian funders. From the 70s on, they started spending huge amounts of money, often not on political parties and not on politicians, but on influence. So they did things like set up research institutes, like the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK, or think tanks that don't declare their funding. They would produce papers that would then get discussed. They would do things like fund lobbyists, fund researchers. This whole kind of stuff that looks like, it doesn't look necessarily just like politics. It doesn't look like politics in the way that we understand, like party politics, but it feeds ideas into the political system. And that's really what I think is really interesting. I think we've often struggled to really think about that. We've thought about politics and influence in politics in very basic terms, getting one party elected, getting someone to do something that they mightn't otherwise do. But actually, it's far more interesting, I think, to think of it in a much more holistic way, and trying to force lots of different, a much broader outcome. And what we've seen, I think, when it comes to things like say the authoritarian turn in politics, actually, when it comes down to it as well, a lot of people who fund kind of libertarian politics are quite happy with authoritarianism in many respects. If you look at someone like Peter Thiel at PayPal, who funded the Trump campaign, has funded a lot of very right-wing, funded a lot of very right-wing movements in the States. He's openly said can kind of take or leave democracy. He's not that mad about it, really. It's certainly not the be all and end all for someone like that. So I think when you've got people who have got a fluid relationship with democracy and the democratic process, well, then it doesn't really matter what stripe they are and what it is what their specific outcome is. I think it's as much about trying to change the political conversation. If you think about it, from where we are now in Britain, okay, not everybody might have got exactly what they wanted from, say, before the Brexit referendum, but they've got huge swathes of the kind of things they want, and the world looks very different. And I think that would look like a result, regardless of whether you are purely a free marketeer or purely someone who's quite authoritarian curious. The general direction of travel is probably in the direction you wanted.
Yeah, okay. That does make sense. One of the things that your book does brilliantly, I think, is this kind of tying together of what might appear to be disparate things. Because, obviously, some of this stuff we're reasonably well aware of now. We're aware now of the use of technology in particular, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, illegal use of Facebook data, all of that kind of stuff. And then, the use of that Trump election, Brexit, etc. But your book also talks about, a much kind of wider range of events, including in Italy and Spain, and then most obviously in Poland and Hungary. And I think, I think that's a massive achievement, really, to show that these are kind of aspects of the same kind of phenomena, really. What did it feel like when you were uncovering that, though? Was that an alarming thing because it genuinely shocked me?
Well, I have to say
the scale of it shocked me.
Yeah, and it's something that I hadn't. My background wasn't. I kind of came to Open Democracy before that. I was working for Channel 4, and I have done I've done a lot of investigations, but I hadn't really ever focused that much on money and politics and political influence. So this really was a new world to me. I think it's one of the reasons why the book kind of unfolded like that. I think if it was a world in which I've been seeked for ages, I think it's one of the reasons political journalists can often be kind of a bit jaded about this sort of thing. I think it doesn't really matter, and and I think that's one of the reasons they struggle to kind of get to these stories and to tell them in a way, because I think they often get a bit they're in the Westminster world, so they don't really realize. I think a lot of people go, I'm really shocked that this is how this happens. I'm shocked that a group can spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on highly aggressive Facebook ads targeted at MPs, that the people behind the group is like a 20-something-year-old student who quite clearly cannot afford to do this. And that's all totally fine. And I think a lot of people, people like you maybe reading the book, go, that's absolutely crazy. I can't believe that's true. And you do not have to tell us where that money came from. And you're going, what? And this all started really with the story about the Democratic Unionist Party's Brexit donation. They spent almost £500,000 on the Brexit campaign. Because it went through Northern Ireland, it didn't have to be disclosed because of loopholes, basically, in electoral law in Northern Ireland. We still don't know where that money came from. It was funneled through a former Conservative Party candidate here in Glasgow, where I'm sitting speaking to you. He had a series of shady businesses begging huge questions. At no stage did he even say that the money was coming from him in the first place. So he was a conduit, just a bag man for the money. And we still don't know where that came from. And I think for a lot of people, that's really surprising. And I found all of that really interesting. And then as I went on, it's quite like the genesis of this work was, I started off doing that DUP story. The first thing I did with Open Democracy, that kind of led to lots more stuff. We did a lot of stuff around the Vote Leave campaign, which broke the law by overspending during the referendum. Dominic Cummings' campaign. Myself, my colleague Jenna Corder did a lot of work on Aaron Banks. And then actually what happened was I started looking around me, and I started the think tank world. I was like, who are all these think tanks? And all these people are citing them all the time. Like Jacob Rees-Mogg is on my television telling me everything will be fine because someone called the Institute of Economic Affairs says it will. And when I started off looking at this, I knew nothing about these guys. I thought they were like the Institute of Fiscal Studies or something. I was like, yeah, they sound quite reputable. And I think that's one of the reasons I probably got quite, because I too was shocked, if I'm being honest. And I think that's one of the reasons the book continued the way it did, because unlike maybe someone who'd been at their dinners or something, I wasn't thinking, but they're quite good guys, really. They're nice to have a pint with. I didn't know them like that, or I only found myself trying to get to know them afterwards, like once I started finding out about them. And then once I started looking more internationally, you can start to see so many of these same, moves, rhetorical moves on things like Facebook, the kind of rise of whatever you want to call it, the nationalist right, really, in Europe, and the influence of the way money and influence has played a role across the continent. I think it's, and I as I say in the book, I don't think it's the only reason these things happen. I don't think it explains everything about it, but I think it's often totally underestimated. We talk so much when you talk about Brexit or the rise of Trump about the left behinds, but actually, if you look at what happened on Capitol Hill less than 2 weeks ago, a lot of those people were not left behind. They were very wealthy. They were not. In the same way that, if it was only the left behind people who voted for Brexit, Britain would still be in the European Union. And I get that's the thing as well, I think, with this. We have a tendency to see things in very, very kind of tropes. And we don't really then think about, well, actually, what was the influence campaign that went behind that? And I would love, I see so many news packages, or there used to be when the Brexit referendum, the aftermath, whenever there was a Brexit debate, they go to a working man's club in Sunderland. And I was always like, why don't you go to the golf club in Sevenoaks? Because they voted for it too. And I think that's part of what I was trying to do, is kind of excavate some of those sort of influence campaigns and why those people were interested in that outcome.
Yeah, exactly. Indeed, yeah. I mean, do you think some of the reaction to, for example, Brexit, do you think some of it was just kind of focusing on things like overspending as though, well, that's a minor thing, that's a kind of slap on the wrist thing, and not quite understanding the importance of why that's such a dangerous thing to allow to happen?
Yeah, I found that really striking too. People were just like, why? Even friends of mine who were political journalists, a bit less so now, but at the start, for the first year, were like, why are you bothering? Who cares? Yeah. And I think that's something that's really dangerous too, where and in some ways you can see the seeds of what happened then, the prorogation of Parliament, all those other things, a very to be the verite fluid approach to law and legislation that we've seen from the Johnson-Cummings government. You can see the roots of all of that in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum. And I think, the problem, I guess, in some ways, that narratively it played really well for Boris Johnson and all the rest of it, kind of Ramon or whatever, insert expletive here. Yeah. But I couldn't get over how, and how it was also frustration because it was very hard to get the opposition political party to care about it as well, which was difficult because you really need political parties to, you need an opposition to take these issues and run with them. especially when it was clear that the governing party had no interest in dealing with them. So no, I think I think like, and the fact that like breaking electoral law, which should be a really serious offence, is a maximum fine of £20,000. So
exactly.
you can overspend by as much as you want actually. And as one person in politics said to me, it's just the cost of doing business. And that's a huge problem. And I think I think this is I think, like, after I finished the book, I wrote a long piece in the London Review of Books recently, which actually is now the afterword of the new paperback edition of my book, which has just come out like a couple of weeks ago, in which I talk about like, well, the reality of where electoral law and things like that are at. And you look at, there's a current, the PAC Act, the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee for long, to give it its long title, is currently having an investigation into the Electoral Commission. And if you look at the Conservative submission to that, it basically suggests getting rid of it. If it doesn't, either you tighten the scope of it massively, or maybe just get rid of it altogether, which is incredible. Like how that's the response to what we're seeing. So no, I think it's, I think it's a real problem. I think it's a huge problem.
And do you think, for people on the left, opposition parties particularly, do you think there's a little bit of them being sort of tempted by the thought, well, we gain a little bit from this stuff ourselves as well anyway, so, and forgetting that this could land up in a very dark place if you're not careful? Do you think some of that goes on?
This has always been the problem, I think, when it comes to electoral politics and election and regulation. It's in nobody's interest, really. It's a kind of turkey. Even politicians who, from opposition parties. Well, if you think about it, like a general election, that's basically is 650 mini general elections in 650 seats. So if you've won your seat, you're like, well, I know how the system works here. I'm not going to mess with it. I'm always really struck, because I'm really sad when the spending returns come out. You can see, people have to, like, the spending cap in Britain is a really good example of this. The spending cap varies. It's about £12,000 to £15,000 depending on constituency size. Nobody thinks that the winning candidates only spend that amount of money. Not a sinner. You couldn't get it. You couldn't. And if you look at the returns that come in, the number of people who spend 99% or more is huge, which is just ridiculous. No, like, you can't budget for that. You've clearly overspent. But actually, what's really funny as well is, if you admit to overspending, oddly many people don't. There's no comeback if you admit to it. It's fine. That's actually, but very few people do actually admit to it. But I think it's just a really good example of kind of what a loose relationship we have with this, and how we've allowed kind of quite important aspects of how democracy is regulated to be underdone. And the other concern I have with it too is that it then allows this space. It's kind of a wider concern I have with a lot of the work I do, actually, is that, like, it allows a space for, like, the opposite, like in America with Trump and the electoral process. It ends up at a space in which, like, the exact opposite stuff can then I worry that it can circulate then, like, people can make, because the problem with politics isn't what happens in the ballot box. I don't have any issues with that. I don't have any issues with the electronic counting of voting that I've ever seen that really stood up to any site in Britain either. Yeah. And I've seen some people circulate and stuff about it. I've never seen any evidence there's any problems with it. The problem, my issues with outside it, but I do also worry that because we haven't taken a grip of what happens outside it, you can let, people, it's quite easy then to say, well, actually, what happens to how they count our votes? And I think there's almost scope for more mistrust in democracy. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I think we've got a couple of questions from social media come in.
Yep, we have. The kind of following on from the thing about the fines on analog methods of communication. There's obviously the different thing with the digital one, because there isn't really a cap on that. And so there's a couple of questions. I'm not sure that I know what one of them actually means, but I'm going to read it out. How can we make the social media platforms responsible? I understand that bit. Does he think that an S230 in the US will force them to take responsibility? And then also a couple others. Why is the ICO not taking more action? And Bill has said, if you have more money, then you can always negotiate your way around an authoritarian government, especially if you help to get them elected. So it's kind of still around money, but about money with the digital platforms and how they spent so much, didn't they, as you delineated in the book. But that never seems to get counted in the £15,000 electoral expenses.
Yeah, but it's fairly easy. So like online, we don't really regulate online politics at all in Britain. And this is despite this being a constant thing. Like every time the Electoral Commission has talked about it too. So there's almost no, so like if I was running for election and I post a leaflet through your door, I have to have a little imprint on it says paid for, on behalf of Peter Geoghegan with me smiling and whoever's paid for it. But if I post it out on social media, I don't have to have anything. And that's still the case. And it's not hard to find. That sort of stuff isn't hard to tighten up. Like in Ireland, they've just brought out the heads of a bill to create a standalone electoral commission. Ireland's been quite behind the curve on that. But it's got really good stuff on this, actually. And it's taken lots of soundings, and it's very, it's not difficult to do it. It can be done. It's just about having the political will to do it. And I think that's the thing we've seen throughout this. It's the same as the previous question there from Paul, like that you have a kind of turkeys voting for Christmas thing, and politicians don't want to do something that they think will potentially harm them in the future.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, thanks. So just on that digital stuff, one of the things that you explain really well in the book is the effects of quite simple things. For example, being able to do targeted advertising, targeted messaging is really erosive to democracy, because it means that essentially I don't have to have a consistent message that my party represents. I can tell one thing to one group, a completely contradictory message to another group, and it just erodes the sense that there's anything consistent that anybody's actually voting for. And that's probably a sort of unintended consequence, but it just goes to show how powerful the effects can be of these little kind of technological abilities.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the huge things, like the change from, when I was growing up, you'd have the local politician with his poster at the end of the road, and and that was kind of how you advertised people. You had to have the same message, really. You couldn't really segment the electorate. It was kind of one message. And what we have seen, I think what social media has allowed to happen is this kind of segmentation of the electorate and a kind of fissuring into like lots of different little groups. And even if you're not targeting ads at them, and even if the targeted ads don't work, I think even the way in which we all segment now, where you are, what Facebook group you're in, whatever else, you're kind of naturally almost self-selected and segmented. And I think it makes it much easier for politicians to target messages at certain segmented groups. Using things like, WhatsApp, I think is interesting too, in which ideas can travel really quickly. Kind of memes and stories and messages can travel really super quickly in that way too. And I think it's really changing the kind of conversation we have. And it's not, I don't think it's a coincidence that we've also ended up in this very majoritarian place where 50+1 equals I can do whatever the hell I want. And I think that's part of that too, that kind of segmentation, that move away from some idea of like, here is a national narrative, here's a story I'm trying to tell to an entire population, towards a far more kind of segmented. And what I think is interesting too, like I reported a bit in the book, is like even looking at the last general election in Britain as well, like the move as well on social media almost into like kind of property politics as theatre. The Conservatives shit posting on social media, like intentionally posting stuff like, rebranding their Twitter account as a fact check account during a live debate, and then pretending like kind of gaslighting everybody by going, well, that doesn't really, who cares? If you're offended by that, you're clearly an idiot. And I think that's what's really quite worrying too, is like the kind of constant push of the norms of democracy and of democratic engagement further and further to the margins. Yeah,
absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about the kind of the money analog of that, because I think it's quite easy to take a fairly cynical view that says, well, all the things you just said, well, politicians are always lied, right? And then in relation to money and business, well, there's always been a close relationship between politics and business, for example, particularly on the right, I suppose. So there's always been room for corruption and buying influence and that kind of stuff. But one of the things that you describe is the relationship, for example, between the Tories and business, in particular in regard to their funding, has changed also quite dramatically over the past few years, with this kind of shift towards support from, say, hedge funds. Can you say something about that? How's that? What's happened there, and why is that important?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, actually. So money in politics matters, because actually, political parties have to kind of feed and clothe themselves and keep themselves ticking over. And actually, interesting as well, That's particularly the case for often for governing parties, because they've got much bigger overheads and they get less short money. So there's actually it can be particularly a kind of challenge. And what we've seen really in the last, especially since, so like just to get like a kind of potted history, really in general outside the New Labour years, and they're trying to change now. Labour's financial support has not unsurprisingly relied mainly on the unions and subscriptions. So that's basically Jeremy Corbyn's money was almost all unions and subscriptions. If you look at the Financial Times, the Sunday Times' famous rich list, the top 50 political donors in that, only one gave money to Labour. I think it was about $5,000, and he also gave money to the Tories in 2019. So, that gives you an idea. So the Labour were not, and they are trying to change this now with Keir Starmer, but Labour and under Tony Blair, it was very different. They had big city donors, and there was a lot of scandals around, Labour in power had so many donation scandals. It was one of the big kind of running issues with Tony Blair's government. But the Tory party, unsurprisingly, is also the party business. But what's interesting is the way the Tory party's donation base has shifted. There's a great story, actually. So originally it would have been, back in the day, the kind of patrician class, the captains of industry. In the 80s, that shifted into the city more and more. And there's a great story about the late Lord McAlpine, unfairly defamed Lord McAlpine, in fairness to him, wandering around the city of London with a bag for cash, just to stick, fill the bag for the Tory party, and that was all totally legal at the time, which is great. So they were, and then basically, and then New Labour came in, and under David Cameron, they tried more and more to build up a much bigger donor base. So they set up things like this leader group of donors. So if you give £50,000 a year, I find this remarkable. If you give £50,000 a year to the Conservative Party, you become a member of their leaders group, which means you can go every quarter to a meeting with the Prime Minister and senior government ministers, all off the record, all private, no notes kept, no record kept of who attends or anything. Like 50 grand.
Bargain basement.
It really is bargain basements. In America, 50 grand wouldn't get you a meeting with your local, with your, not even your local senator, but your local representative in your state legislature. But anyway, so they started trying to bring him to kind of diversify more and more. But what's happened in the wake of the Brexit referendum is the party, a lot of the Tory money was pro-EU city money. And a lot of the city were in favour of remaining in the European Union, like the big city. The banks, Goldman Sachs, the City Corporation, they were all in favor. They are not Brexiteers. And after the Brexit referendum, that money started to flow out to the Conservative Party, and it has been replaced really a lot with hedge fund money. People like Peter Cruddas, the former Tory, Tory treasurer, who Boris Johnson remarkably elevated to the House of Lords a couple of weeks ago for the first time ever, in the face of a letter from the House of Lords Appointments Commission saying, do not make this man a member of the House of Lords because of issues around that have previously been reported in the Sunday Times about cash for access. So there's been a move towards kind of what's speculative capital. And what's really interesting about this is like the hedge fund world. There's two things I think people often misunderstand about the hedge fund world. One is that they're often quite they're slightly different to the city trader types. They're less likely. They kind of see themselves as anti-establishment. They have a self-perception. People like Chris Benodi, famous Tory donor, Brexit party donor. He famously spent a lot of money, gave a lot of money to the Leave side during the Brexit referendum, almost £1 million, but then made, I think it was 800 million on the night of the referendum, betting that sterling would collapse.
Yes.
So he's kind of and they're kind of famous for this kind of what a lot of people would see as quite spivvy behavior. Yeah. But what's interesting about this, is that these people see themselves as anti-establishment, but also it's this wider move away from even national, international capital. So like people who own things that make things. So if you're an international business, you're still like Nissan in Sunderland. You're an international business who's got a national footprint. Hedge fund money is not like that. It's completely internationalized, and it's not sunk. It is not tied to the national economy. It doesn't really care about the national economy massively. It has its vested interest in volatility. It's very hard to make. So we've had an era of rock bottom interest rates. It is quite hard for hedge funds to make speculative cash in an era of rock bottom interest rates, unless they've been investing in tech stocks over the last kind of 12 to 18 months. There's not a lot of returns out there. And so there's actually what you've got for hedges is this perfect synthesis, I think, of self-perception, desire to be part of the ruling elite too, plus business interest. And it's very hard to unpick I think it's often very hard to unpick where one thing happens and the other doesn't. And if you think, these are not, for some of these very rich people, like, someone like Peter Hargreaves, who bankrolled Iron Banks is really, really quite like rank Leave.eu campaign during the Brexit referendum. He's given quite a lot of money to Conservative Party recently. I think he might have given money to the Brexit Party. He's a billionaire. Like, this is kind of small change, a few million quid. Like, it isn't like, and so I think sometimes we can misapply what we think is happening here. Sometimes, like I'm sure he's got eyes on returns, but he's also got a bunch of things he cares about too. So in the grand scheme of things, they all, and there's a constellation of reasons why people give money to politicians. Then other people give money to politicians because they want to reputation launder. You've seen that a lot. We saw it under New Labour, and we see it under the Conservative Party too. You want to get yourself into the House of Lords. This is a series of reasons why, people donate to political parties. But it has been really fascinating to see this shift it's kind of a shift from a productive economy into a speculative economy in terms of like where these people are coming from. But it ties in, what's really interesting, like when I was writing my book and I was doing all my research about it, like I was always a little bit like, is it really all about deregulation? Is it really all about the Singapore-on-Thames model? And you can make the argument you can certainly make the argument that did not win the Brexit referendum vote. And I do believe that there is not 50 plus 1% of the population who would vote for that. And I remember some people like always pushing back on me on that. And I do feel a bit like today, just in the Times this morning, you're reading about Boris Johnson going to meet business leaders to put up this new idea of a kind of British Singapore with lower regulations and all the rest of it. So well, do the maths, guys. I don't, if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, I think it's probably a duck.
Yeah, exactly. Indeed. I think we've got another question come in.
Yeah, I've got a couple, quite different. One is really interesting perspective, which is, do you think that targeted advertising is a form of coercive control? Which I think is a very interesting, certainly from a female perspective, that's an interesting thing, but men can suffer it too. An interesting question from Twitter. You have links to both Scotland and Ireland. Do you feel that the political disruption caused by Brexit will ultimately have a greater impact in Scotland or Ireland with regard to pressure for changes in the constitutional settlement? So obviously that's something of particular interest to us here in Scotland. And just another one from Bill, ought it to be illegal to spend money on a policy which you believe will damage your society? E.g. that O'Day guy clearly believed the pound would collapse if Leave won, so we spent a bunch on making Leave happen. So 3 completely different questions there. Sorry about that.
If I forget them, remind me. On the first one, on ads and coercive control, I think it's interesting. There's a quote in my book which I'm trying to find from Gavin Miller, who's a very famous, an excellent QC, and really is the expert in Britain on electoral law. And I think it's undue influence is what he talks about. And there's a law against undue influence when it comes to politics, and it goes back to the 19th century and the rotten boroughs, where you'd have elections for an MP with 3 candidates or 3 voters, and all sorts of shenanigans would go on. And so there's a law about undue influence. And his kind of argument is that you cannot know you cannot know how you're being targeted. You cannot know how you're being targeted at the time you're being targeted. And therefore that could qualify as a form of undue influence. And I think I kind of do think there's something in it. Like, I think we're still only trying to figure out, like, there's a bunch of conversations when it comes to target advertising. And I think we often get stuck in this really reductive one of, does it work? Does it make you change your mind about something? But I'm really sure that that's the point. I'm really sure it's the point of, like, it's almost not the point of advertising, full stop. I think to think about it purely like that misses the much bigger way in which the general conversations around a topic start to change. The general ideas that ferment down. And I think that's the kind of thing that I think, like, target advertising and just online advertising in general has been really effective at, in terms of, like, putting stuff out there and, like, kind of just clouding the waters, making things a bit more, oh God, I wonder. And I think that's what it's been really, really, really effective at doing. I'm probably going to have to get you to ask.
The Scotland and Ireland one.
Oh, Scotland and Ireland, yes. I think it's good. Yeah, I think it will be. I actually wrote a piece for the Sunday National, which was out yesterday, like, talking about, like, kind of the prospects of independence referendums in Scotland and of a border poll in Ireland. I do think it has definitely changed the conversation in a huge way, and it's kind of hard to see how it doesn't. Whatever happens, it's hard to not see it having a very significant effect on what happens. I always think about it like, imagine you're reading a history book and you kind of got this Brexit referendum, and you got to the aftermath, and you got to all this tumult, these years of tumult. You'd hardly imagine in the history book went, and then everything was fine. They'd all vote for something else, but everyone went, "Oh, that's grand. Let's continue." And I think if you take a slightly step back view of it, it's hard to see. Events always have a repercussion eventually. They don't. That is just the nature of history. You don't have to be a Marxist to believe that. There's a historical arc, and once you started down it, it doesn't really go, "Oh God, well, fair enough." Actually, it's happened now. The SNP go, "God, yeah, well, if Johnson's right, we've had Brexit. Let's all make a success of it." That's just So I think it could have quite profound. Profound implications in the short term, but also I think in the medium and the long term. I think it's going to be. It's hard not to see it. I was quite struck yesterday in the Sunday Times. Dominic Sambrook, who will be a conservative historian, really, he was reviewing two books. One by Robert Holmes, I guess he's a historian of France, really, the Brexiteer Telegraph writer, and the other by Philip Stevens, the long-term FT commentator, from very different perspectives on Britain's place in Europe. And Sambrook's conclusion is like, really, Stevens is just tired, like a Whitehall presentation, and Holmes is much more thoughtful. And like, really, if you think about it, like the Corn Laws and the Home Rule question, now you look back on it, who really remembers what these things were about? And you're like, well, the Home Rule question has literally still been, it's the centenary, the foundation of Northern Ireland, which is where that came from. If you think that the Northern Ireland question is settled, that's an interesting perspective. And similarly, Scotland didn't have Home Rule, which was on the cards. And in some ways, we've been playing catch up politically ever since. So no, I find it very hard to see this doesn't have a kind of long-term effect.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. What was I going to ask? Yeah, so I suppose the next thing to ask really is, so your book came out last year. Quite a lot of politics has happened in the meantime, which is a slight understatement. I just wondered, what do you make of events since then? What do you think are the most important, or for you, the most surprising things that have happened since then?
Well, I ended up spending like a lot of people when the COVID pandemic hit. I was like, well, what does it mean for almost the work I do? And I kind of found myself I just ended up looking at things like government contracts back in kind of April. And that turned into, unexpectedly, I wasn't expecting that to turn into a very rich seam of stories. I wasn't expecting the government to award contracts to all of its mates and to create VIP lists for politically connected firms to get preferential treatment. But lo and behold, that's what was happening. So I spent many months doing that last year. So that was probably the big thing, in my work life I was focusing on, was like trying to hold the government to account over things like that. And in one way, the biggest challenge I have, and people like me, is that it is harder and harder to hold this government to account. Because you can, I was really struck. The last minister to resign was Sajid Javid, the only minister to resign under Boris Johnson was Sajid Javid, who, in fairness to him, kind of did resign on a reasonable point of principle, that he couldn't have Dominic Cummings picking his advisors, which actually, you can argue that was a pretty democratic thing for Javid to resign on. But you've seen Priti Patel is still in her job. Robert Jenrick admitted apparent bias and is still in his job too. So I think there's a kind of, if a culture comes from the top, and I think Boris Johnson's while Boris Johnson particularly remains Prime Minister, there's a sense in which accountability kind of goes out the window. And it does make the jobs of people like me much harder, because you can find this information, you can put it out there, you can show people, look, this is what's happened, but then you want something to change, or some action to take place based on that. So I think that's been, in some ways, one of the things that I've been really, really struck by. And I guess I've been also just more generally, there's the kind of magic, I have been slightly disconcerted to see the kind of magical thinking approach to politics seems to continue in Britain. The kind of Brexit bloviating. And I find like the thing I'm always trying to do, and even I find it hard, is not to get sucked up into the news cycle because it's so easy. And it's kind of, it suits politicians really well for everything to last 24 hours or less. And I feel like my job as a journalist is constantly to try and go, no, let's stand back and see what's going on here. Let's try and dig beneath that thing, and identify those things. And, because otherwise it's really easy, I think, for politicians to just steamroller through stuff. And I do worry that that's happening still. I think that's really different, you know, that we have seen that. And we saw that, like, and we saw, I think, the limits we've seen over the last few months of the pandemic response, you know, the limits of that approach to government. And I think there's also like kind of an interesting, almost bigger, like Western democracy question with the response to the COVID crisis. You know, the Western democratic states have done the worst out of this, and, you know, with some exceptions, both in terms of who've done all right and some exceptions of non-Western states who've done even really badly too, like Brazil. But Brazil's leader, I'm sure, did not help. I've not read into Brazil's an in-depth analysis of it, but when your leader says it doesn't happen and that the vaccine will turn you into a crocodile, it shouldn't be that surprising when you end up with real problems. But I think there's something really interesting about where we're at politically in general. Like, how did we get to a stage where pretty much across the piece, you know, with worse and better examples, every government has made a series of assumptions about people and the electorate that turned out to be false. You know, the assumption at the very start of this was that people would not tolerate any restrictions on their freedoms and movements, and that's the reason we now have all these restrictions on our freedoms and movements. And I think there's something really interesting about a collective groupthink and what happens with, you know, I think there's a bunch of questions for Western democracy on the other side of this.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, one of the big things for me was just how the current government, how Boris Johnson has managed to remain so popular. You know, despite massive mismanagement and cronyism and, you know, multi-million pound contracts with friends and all the rest of it, it's still at what, 37% or whatever it is.
It's huge. It's fascinating. It's you know, by historic standards, Boris Johnson is a very, very popular. Well, his party is very popular. You know,
yes.
He, you know, it depends where you go as well. He's not particularly popular in Scotland, so it is definitely a regional. It's a regionally variated landscape for Boris Johnson.
It can definitely, can confirm that one. Definitely.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Unfortunately, we are sort of running out of time, really. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about, you know, kind of the future and, you know, what you think is fixable and how to go about fixing things. I read your book immediately after reading Ian Dunt's book on liberalism, and that was a bit of a double whammy, really. And, you know, one of the things that really alarmed me about it was, you know, obviously Ian Dunt talks a lot about threats to liberalism, and what your book describes is essentially the mechanics of that. If you want to destroy liberal democracy, then these are the means by which people are attempting to achieve that, really, in a lot of senses. So, really my sort of final thing is about what can be fixed and how, and what gives you cause for optimism for the future.
Well, I guess like there's almost like two different things. I write a little bit in my book. I try and come up with, it's not a policy proposal book, but I did want to at least have a few suggestions. And there's almost like two sides of it. One is the technocratic side of it. You know, the kind of things I was talking to you about. You know, electoral reform, problems with electoral law. There's a series of technocratic fixes that would help. You know, like simple things like, you know, having a proper fines. And the Scottish government actually the Scottish Parliament did pass legislation last year on if there is a second independence referendum, which will bring the Electoral Commission's fines up to £500,000, but I think it will only work for donations in Scotland. But which is interesting. So it's not hard to do. So there's a bunch of technocratic stuff that, you know, lots of people who are even smarter than me, could really design tomorrow. You know, there's things that we could take money out. I think we need to take big money out of politics. I think we've seen that with the COVID crisis. You know, this is a real problem that people can spend small amounts of money and get political access. And that's what it's about. I think it's less about like, he is a donor, let's give him a contract. It's like having the access. And we can see what was happening in the government. The government was like, what do we do? Let's call up our mate. He might know. And then and that's the problem. And there's a kind of sense in which that's not seen as a problem. And I think that's an even bigger problem. You know, it would almost, and even the way we talk about it, chumocracy and stuff, you're like, I don't know, it's cronyism. Like if you saw this in another country, you wouldn't say it was a chumocracy. You know, you'd say it was cronyism and clientelism. Like call it what it is. And because they're different words to corruption, you know, and there's a question about what corruption does. Corruption involve intentional favoring? You know, we have these words for a reason, and we can use them. And I try and use them as much as I can, and try and use them as accurately as I can. So I think that's quite that there's a series of things you could do around that would really help. But at the same time, I do think, like I said, that comment I made about Western democracies, I do think there's also like a much deeper conversation around democracy and democratic engagement that, you know, is much harder to do. And I don't have all the answers for that. But I do think there's something going on there. And there is something about this widespread mistrust of democracy that we're missing something, and politicians are missing something. And we've kind of, it's very easy to play into tribal narratives, it turns out, you know, very, very, very easy. And there's a lot to be said for it. It's one of the tiny stats in my book. But I've always thought it was really interesting is that the average length of a Brexit Party Facebook status update in 2019 ahead of the European Parliament elections, in which they topped the poll, was 19 characters. The average status update for Change UK, I'm sure some of your listeners remember Change UK, the short and ill-fated,
yes,
kind of a moderate, kind of centrist Tory and Labour Party. I think theirs was something like 74 or 75. I think there's something about that too. There's about like the way in which certain sections have figured out really easily how to kind of like how to coin slogans. And we've seen it with the COVID stuff too. I've been shocked at how late it's taken people to call out these grifters and these COVID lockdown skeptics. I think, and finally it's happened. You can see it feels like in the last week it's finally happened, 9 months later. But they've done it, really cleverly, it's just the flu and the cure is worse than disease. You can see the series of tropes. And I think that's what's really, there's a kind of sense in which, like, for whatever reason, discourse and democratic discourse has become so pared back. And I think almost the extent to which we have democratic discourse has become so pared back. And I do think social media has contributed to that too, in terms of like a kind of like bifurcation and that kind of segmentation. And people feel much more like, I think we have less face-to-face discussions about things, which I do think is a problem. People know less and less people who disagree with them about things. And I do think that's a problem. I think there's all those sorts of things. And I think they all help feed, they kind of lance the majoritarian boil in which 50+1 means I can do whatever I want.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you. Unfortunately, we really have run out of time. So I just want to say thank you so much for your time. We chatted to Peter Jukes last year, and he was describing journalism as a noble endeavor, and I totally agree with that. So we just applaud you for your work and everything you're doing, because it's incredible.
Thank you very much.
It's important stuff and has our full-hearted support. So just thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, guys. It's been lovely to chat to you.
Cheers.